The reason why Maxie has never heard a cross word from the rest of us is because we hold private meetings with him not being there and air all of those grievances. No, we are deeply grateful for the presence of Maxie and the work that we're trying to do. And those of you who know him know his sweet spirit and his congeniality and his love for God and the Word and advancing the cause of Christ. Now, he also didn't tell you that I was not originally selected to speak today, and I'm kind of a holdover. The person that he had selected was not able to come, and so I filled in for him. And you heard the preacher that said to another preacher, boy, for them to have you speak on this lectureship, they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the preacher said, well, that may be true, but at least I'm in the barrel. This is a fantastic subject. You remember the statement, it's been quoted many times, misquoted actually, but the gist of it is there in the statement that vigilance is the price of liberty. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I traced that little statement down. Maxie had it in the instructions that served as guidelines for preparing this lecture. And I traced it to this John Philpot Curran back in 1790 in Dublin, a speech that he delivered at a political gathering. And the actual statement reads, the condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance. Now we can identify with that as Americans, can't we? Liberty is a key term in American civilization and history. And we relish that term, and we hold it up and have held it up for over 200 years in our history as a nation and as a country. We understand that the precious blood of many, literally thousands and thousands of young men has been the price that has been paid in order to guarantee and to perpetuate the freedom that this great nation has enjoyed for over 2 centuries. And so we understand what it means to be vigilant, to be alert, to be watchful. Those who lived through World War II remember that as the 30s proceeded and our nation was focused upon widespread economic depression, that there was a failure to a large extent on the part of our government and the population to recognize the foreboding signs and the ominous threat that was developing across the ocean. And thus on December 7th, 1941, our country was taken largely by surprise. Vigilance, alertness, watchful anticipation would have spared the lives of many sailors who were killed in Hawaii. We can relate to that then. We can understand that. As I was about to ascend the rostrum, Brother Cosgrove commented to me that he knows a fellow out in West Texas, Midland, I think was where he said he resides, whose face is disfigured. I think one eye is missing and his ear is missing. Bad facial disfigurement. Because during World War II, he was in Patton's army. And as they were advancing across Germany, late one night they found a little farmhouse in which to take refuge for the night. And that little band of soldiers was exhausted, fatigued, worn out. They left one American soldier on duty as a watchman, while the rest of them attempted to secure badly needed rest. But alas, that watchman fell asleep. And in the meantime, an enemy soldier approached that location and took a hand grenade and threw it inside of that structure where all of those soldiers were sleeping. And some 3 or 4 were killed and the rest badly injured. All because one man who had been assigned the task of staying awake. See, there's no problem here, Max, even though it's after lunch, keeping people awake. That's my topic. If you fall asleep, you will be like many throughout history, both secular and sacred, who failed to do their duty Many men were killed on that day, all because one man failed to take the necessary responsibility upon him to be vigilant in behalf of others. As I studied this matter in both the Old and the New Testament, I found that that's exactly what the Bible teaches. The comparisons, the illustrations that I've just advanced are uncannily close to what the Bible depicts along this line. And if we as Americans hold deep within our hearts and our emotions great concern for the liberty and the freedom that this nation enjoys, and we are able to become emotional and shed tears and rise up even in great concern and indignation if any threats are leveled toward the security of our nation, how much greater ought our concern to be for the spiritual nation of which we have been privileged to be a part. If we want to talk about being vigilant, if we want to talk about being watchful and alert, there is no entity, there is no institution, and there is no individual on the face of the earth that merits our vigilance like the cause of Christ. The church was purchased with the precious blood of Jesus. Eternal liberty has been made available at such a high cost. In fact, I think the Bible would confirm the fact that it's the highest possible cost that could be paid. There is no greater commodity that could have been forthcoming to make possible the freedom that we are privileged to enjoy in Christ. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. If anything ever deserved to be preserved, protected, and prized and defended, it is the liberty and the freedom that we are privileged to experience as a result of the blood of Christ. There may be a lot of things that we hold dear in this life, but of all things, more than anything else in the world, our salvation, our connection to Christ deserves to be jealously guarded. It should be more important to us than our mates. Our standing with God merits more of our time, more of our attention than all other concerns of the human race put together. Our freedom in Christ, more than anything else in the world, is worthy of being preserved with the utmost diligence and supreme vigilance. As a people belonging to God, we simply must be vigilant people. Vigilance comes from the Latin word vigilare. Here are the definitions. To keep awake. That's the heart and root of that Latin term. English dictionaries expand upon that. Alertness, keen awareness, watchfulness in guarding against danger, giving careful attention to circumstances so as to avoid danger, to seize the opportunity. Vigilance, therefore, suggests not only attention, but action. It's not enough to be very conscious and aware. One must be willing to proceed and act upon one's alertness. That's the concept presented in the Bible. 3 different Greek terms that summarize the Bible's presentation of vigilance. One of the terms means to arouse from sleep. Wake up. Another one of the terms refers to absence of sleep. In other words, don't go to sleep. See, one of them is, you're asleep, wake up. The other one is, don't even go to sleep. You stay awake. Be watchful. Be sleepless. And the third term means, do not permit your mind to come under the influence of beclouding, confusing, hampering influences. And so in that sense, remain awake and alert and sober-minded. As we go through the Bible, we are warned to be vigilant in at least 4 areas. Number 1, when it comes to Satan. You know the words in 1 Peter chapter 5. Be sober. Be vigilant. Your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Whom resist, steadfast in the faith. Think for just a moment about the figurative language that's taking place there. That God is, for our benefit, comparing Satan to a lion. He's clearly zeroing in on his ferocity. He's ferocious. And he's hungry. You know, the lion that is being depicted here is not one that has just consumed a wildebeest or some African animal and he's just sitting over there licking his chops, not interested in bothering anyone else for a few hours or days. No, Satan's hungry. And he remains hungry. He wants to taste us. He is after Christians. And he has all of the ferociousness and the diligence and the persistence of a hungry, man-eating lion. He's after us. I suppose one of the best portraits of that being demonstrated in this world was the life of Job. It so amazes me that Job's three friends, throughout that 42-chapter narrative, consistently insisted that God was the author of Job's affliction. God is doing this to you, Job, because you have sinned. Job said, I don't think I have sinned. But he agreed with his three friends that God was the author of his affliction. They were all four wrong in that regard. God was not the instigator of Job's maladies. God was not the one who was causing such torment and grief and anguish in Job's life. The first two chapters make perfectly clear it was Satan. Satan was the author of that hardship and stress and tribulation. Now think about the application of that teaching to us today. How much suffering and misery and calamity and catastrophe is implemented against human civilization and specifically against God's people by Satan himself. You know, we sometimes shy away from the biblical teaching about Satan because we understand the Bible teaches that miracles no longer occur. But again, go back and read Job chapter 1 and 2. There was no miracle in the afflictions that were perpetrated against Job. They all came through natural, ordinary means. Whether it was invading marauders who came and carried off Job's economic assets and executed his servants, or the large storm that came up and collapsed the house in which his children were enjoying a meal together. These were just common things that happen even today. And it never seems to dawn upon Job and his three friends that Satan was even a possible explanation for this torment. But we need to understand that he is. That Satan is alive and well. And he is after us every bit as much as he has been after others throughout Bible history. We therefore must be sober, on guard. You know, that's what swordsmen say, Johnny. Swordsmen, just before they begin their bout, they say, on guard. That means get ready. I'm coming. I'm letting you know. And that's what Christians need to do. Be on guard against spiritual drowsiness, bewilderment, untouched by spiritual sleep, and both physical and spiritual influences that can cloud our minds and lessen the sharpness with which we approach the Christian life. Notice how often the Bible refers in the New Testament to the efforts that Satan makes to get us. What about 2 Corinthians 2:11? Paul puts his arms around the church and says, you know, we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. I wonder if that can be said about every Christian. Don't you know? Are you not conscious of the fact that Satan is using devices, schemes, ploys. That's New Testament. Go over to Ephesians chapter 6, where after warning us to put on the whole armor of God, that's a protective, defensive mechanism in living the Christian life. He says that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So he's got devices and schemes, and he's got wiles, tricks. You remember in the Roadrunner cartoons, I'm sure that's not the best source for me to draw my illustrations from, but you remember that that cute little obnoxious Roadrunner was constantly assaulted by Wile E. Coyote. Wiley. The authors of that cartoon were trying to get across the notion of craftiness, cunningness, deceptiveness. He schemed and plotted and did everything he could. He kept Acme in business, that place that he was always ordering these machines and gimmicks and gadgets from. I don't know why he didn't take that money and go to his nearest restaurant and buy a Roadrunner dinner. But he spent all kinds of effort and money and time. Tormented himself, all to try to get through cunning craftiness that little Roadrunner. The Bible describes Satan as wily. As wily. Are we going to be so naive and so blasé that we will not face up to the fact that in every 24 hours of the day, we are fair game? And Satan knows it. He knows his time is limited. He must apply all of his efforts to do all of the damage that he possibly can to our spirits. How often then do we need to be shook and told, wake up! You're leaving yourself vulnerable here. The wily Satan and serpent is after you. He wants to ensnare us. Also in Ephesians chapter 6, down in verse 16, we have another term that's used to describe Satan's ploys that he implements against us. The King James Version uses the term, the fiery darts of the evil one. He warns us the only way to withstand those, the only way to deflect those, is to use the shield of faith. Now, I think the imagery here would best be illustrated by what we as Americans understand to have taken place on the frontier in the West. You remember how fierce Indians, in attacking wagon trains that were trying to make their way through the wilderness, through the desert to the West Coast, and they would circle those wagons. That was a pretty good strategy, I suppose, so they could put their backs to each other and defend themselves as much as possible. But what can you do when instead of trying to breach that protective barrier, the Indian is clever enough to take an arrow and wrap some sort of a cloth around the end and dip it in some sort of a flammable liquid and then set it on fire and just sit out there? He doesn't even have to approach you. Just sit out there and let those arrows go and light those wagon trains up. Same sort of thing happened in the early part of American history whenever fortresses were built out on the western frontier. Fires could be caused and the structure actually be endangered because of the extent to which that fire could spread so quickly, when actually the people need to be spending all of their time on the gate and on the walls watching for a possible attack. Don't you find it extremely descriptive for God to say, that's what Satan's doing to you? He's shooting flaming arrows at you. Can we understand what God is telling us? I don't expect to walk out through these doors today and start looking around, expect some sort of a fireball to come flying over the building or something at me. So what's he talking about? Is he not talking about all of those isolated little moments of discouragement, the threats that come to our spiritual safety? It might be something you see on TV. You might be watching a program that evokes lust that engenders illicit sexual desire. An arrow's being shot at your face. And it's Satan's intention to set you on fire and burn you up spiritually. It's easy to talk theoretically about, oh yeah, I see those arrows and I can withstand those, and then in the next minute to go right off and allow oneself to be sucked in by the wily Satan. The more we study God's Word, the more we will sharpen our faculties where we can recognize when Satan is approaching us. Sometimes that's part of the problem. People are involved in things before they even stop and realize, I've just been pulled into this. This is wrong. How often does that happen with our tongues and our thoughts? We see something that some other member of the church is doing that we don't particularly like. Not that it's sin or anything, it just irritates us. And so we make some comment under our breath to somebody else, look what they're doing. How many people stop right there and get a hold of themselves and say, I've just allowed Satan to use me. I ought not to be bad-mouthing this brother over here. If you want to badmouth somebody, badmouth Satan. He's the one that's attacking. And yet how easily we are just brought right into a disruptive situation. I would suggest to you that's how it usually happens in the church. It's much easier for Satan to attack us from within than to bring some ominous liberal digression approach from the outside. Oh, that's happening in the church today, but so much is going on just among brethren, cutting and slashing each other. He's getting a lot done. And the whole time, the people that are doing it pride themselves in being paragons of conservatism and doctrinal faithfulness as they murder their brother for a reason totally unacceptable to God. Are you surprised at that? No, Satan is a trickster. He is slick. You remember when Paul himself in 2 Corinthians 12 said that he was being mistreated. He called it a thorn in the flesh. You remember what else he called it? The messenger of Satan. The messenger of Satan. Who was after Eve in Genesis 3? Who was after Jesus in Matthew 4 and Luke 4? He's been slinging arrows and setting traps and implementing his schemes for centuries. Paul even used the term in 2 Timothy 2:26, referring to Christians who were ensnared by the devil. A snare is a trap. You know those big bear traps that the trappers out west use? Those large metal ones that really it's difficult for a man with considerable strength to pry open and set. You imagine what one of those does to an animal when it snaps shut with those teeth? That's what Satan's doing. He's got snares, he has traps, and he is trying to sneak up on unsuspecting human beings and to ensnare them. How are you going to avoid that? Vigilance, alertness, soberness, watchfulness. Another category in which we are warned biblically to be alert and to be vigilant has to do with elders. Aren't they critical tools in the hands of God for keeping the church safe? No wonder then, Hebrews 13:17, the definitive passage, they watch in behalf of your souls as they that shall give an account. I suppose every preacher who has worked with local churches for any length of time never ceases to be awed and amazed that there can be men who have been appointed to such a position who do not seem to understand what God is going to hold them accountable for. That they will stand before God, and in addition to receiving an assessment from God Himself concerning their own behavior, their own spirituality, He's going to say, now I want to talk to you about Brother and Sister McGillicuddy over here, and Fred and Wilma over here. He's going to talk about a lot of people and hold them accountable That's scary. What an awesome responsibility. No wonder he says they must be watchful. A shepherd not only has a plurality of sheep to keep up with, he has all of these threatening influences to contend with. He's got wolves, he's got weather, he's got rough terrain. It's not an easy job. He's got his own spiritual condition. He's got to rest, he's got to sleep. And so he has an awesome task that requires diligence. You remember when Paul summoned the Ephesian elders from Ephesus over to the coast in Miletus, delivered to them that little farewell address in Acts chapter 20, warning them to take heed to themselves and to the flock, pointing out to them that wolves would enter in, not sparing the flock. And he concluded in Acts chapter 20, verse 31, "Wherefore watch ye." Paul himself repeatedly engaged in what he called, 2 Corinthians 6:5, watchings. Folks, it's clear the Bible teaches elders are shepherds, men who lose sleep for the cause of Christ. God's shepherds are to be like the watchman of Ezekiel 3. What is a watchman? It's a man who watches. What's a watchtower? It's a platform from which to watch. They've got to be watching. It's so easy for all of us, let alone elders, to spend our time watching people and things that don't need to be watched. Squabbling amongst ourselves while peripheral members are falling prey to wolves that are picking them off one at a time on the outskirts of the flock. It's easy to be watchful toward people who are spiritually stable and don't need to be watched. But think of those who are fading from the flock and go virtually unnoticed. Remember under the Old Testament, that scathing assessment that God gave, Ezekiel 34, of those shepherds. Severe pronouncement of judgment. 1 Peter chapter 5 makes clear the same applies in the spiritual realm. Our brotherhood is facing unparalleled spiritual decline. The church is in trouble. I repeat that frequently, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm depressed about that. I'm just as excited about the potential and the future of the church as one could be in any time in the history of the Lord's church. But we would be naive if we did not look around and realize that we are facing some tough times, that there are large segments of our brotherhood that are being drawn away into digressive behaviors. That's going on. I believe the bulk of it is being perpetrated by slick, young preachers. But I also believe in the light of eternity, when all stand before the judgment bar of God, God's going to lay the blame, the ultimate responsibility at the feet of elders. Because every one of these slick, young, smooth-talking preachers are in congregations where elderships are situated. And God will not be pleased. What is happening to such large segments of the flock being carried off into these left-wing views and positions? What's happening? I was just told by someone yesterday or today, this week is a blur. Is it that way for you? Someone told me that somewhere there was a church where on Wednesday night they had a candlelight communion service. I think it was a church in Oklahoma. It just happened over the holidays as part of their holiday festivities. I'm talking about a church of Christ. It was optional, he said, not mandatory for the congregation. It was optional, but Wednesday night, candlelight, communion service. I mean Lord's Supper. Now, who's going to be responsible for that? I bet if you went and searched that out, you'd find the preacher was probably the one that came and heard it somewhere and he's slipping it in. But where are the shepherds? Where are the older members of the church who have lived their lives at a point where the church was not faced by such foolishness? Where are they at? Standing back, just kind of grumbling around the edges, and ultimately putting up with it? You remember how that's the whole attitude of the Israelite nation. Remember when David, young little sprout, he could not understand how God's people could stand there day after day after day and put up with the ridicule and the challenge and the torment that these Philistines were giving. Day after day, that giant would come out there once again, probably about the same time every day. Ha ha, you guy, where's your God? You can't. And they were all just frightened. You think God was pleased with that? Don't you imagine he was up there thinking, these people not know who I am, what I can do, what my will is? He's thinking the same thing today. It took a little pipsqueak, half-grown nobody to step out there and embarrass everyone. They ought to have been ashamed that someone hadn't already gone out there and taken the challenge. Somebody should have walked out there and said, kill me. If you can, try, you may. But we're not going to put up with this nonsense anymore. David said, how dare you defy the armies of the living God? That's it. No more. If we're living during any time at all, we're living in a time where we need that kind of attitude, militancy, a spirit of vigilance, watchfulness that will take action. It's what we need. I'm not urging you to go out and to browbeat people and to kick them 3 or 4 times and laugh at them and mistreat them. That's how some people interpret the militancy that the Bible enjoins. That's not becoming of the Spirit of Christ. But at the same time, there is such a teaching in the Bible of standing up and taking a firm stand in behalf of God. Notice in Revelation 3:2, Jesus warned the church at Sardis to be watchful. He said, I have found no works of thine perfected before my God. Notice in Colossians 4:2, Paul said, continue in prayer and watch in the same with thanksgiving. See, watchfulness, vigilance goes hand in hand with prayer. Got to have them both. You remember when Jesus was in Gethsemane facing death, suffering. You remember he instructed his inner circle of apostles to watch. He went on further, returned, they were asleep. The very opposite of vigilance. He said, what, could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's the admonition that we need to constantly present to ourselves. We are fighting a war with the flesh and with the world, and in some cases with our own apostate brethren. First thing we need to do is pray, and then watch, and then act. Let me briefly call your attention to one Old Testament character. There are many, I suppose, that no doubt flash through your mind. But Phinehas has always impressed me. There are at least 3 incidents in his life that are just so commendable. I'll mention 2 very briefly. One took place in Numbers 25. Do you remember who Phinehas was? The grandson of Aaron, the grandnephew of Moses. You remember how at this point in history they were in the midst of the 40-year meandering in the desert, and you remember how the people were being wooed and influenced by false religion, which had as parts of their Moabite religion sexual immorality. And so they were being involved in this worship of Baal and the sexual behavior that accompanied that. And it was pretty wide scale. Some 24,000 people were executed by God's emissaries on that day. Can you imagine that? How'd you like to dig all of those graves? And there was a high moment there. You know, it was bad enough that they were over there in that Moabite camp doing all that, but one fellow had the unmitigated gall to bring a Moabite woman and parade her right in front of everybody in Israel, and then to go into a tent together. And everybody saw it. But there's no indication anybody wanted to do anything about it. except Phinehas. I don't know that this happened, but I can just imagine him standing there going, is anybody going to do anything about that? He went over and picked up a javelin, a spear, and followed them into the tent. The Bible says he drove it through them, apparently in one thrust. Now, how many liberal preachers preach that text? I'll give $5 to anybody that can find one. I'll just put out a challenge. $5 all Maxie and I can afford, but I bet that text never mentioned. Makes no sense to liberal thinking. What was in God's mind when that happened? Twice, Numbers 25 has God saying, that fellow's going to be rewarded because he is zealous for me. It even goes ahead and describes how this guy has the same mental outlook. He has the same concern and perspective that I have. I'd give anything for God to write that about me. He wrote it about Phinehas and blessed him for succeeding generations because of that kind of, the King James uses the term jealousy. Godly concern that God's will be advanced at the expense of anybody and anything. Another incident takes place over in Joshua. Quite some time has gone by. Remember, the conquest of the land is described, and much of it had taken place by Joshua chapter 22. In fact, so much so that the 2.5 Transjordan tribes were prepared to finish up their responsibilities in assisting the other tribes in taking over and conquering the land. They're ready to go back, cross the Jordan, and enter into their tribal homelands. And so they bid farewell to their brothers, and they leave on the journey home. They come to the Jordan River, a major geographical division or obstacle to its connection with the western tribes. And they stop and they start pulling out these big stones and building what appeared to be an altar right on the banks of the Jordan River. Then they cross the river and scatter to their homelands. I hope that I'm permitted to be with God and to ask this question. How did word about that get back to everybody else? The Bible does not say. But I would suggest to you that the person who spread that would be what the New Testament call a gossip. Whoever it was, man or woman, went back and started spreading the word. Hey, you know what I saw? And obviously put such a slant on that the only way for everybody to interpret that was these people are building an alternate sacrificial site in direct violation of the law of Moses. And do you know the entire nation on that side of the Jordan gathered together at Shiloh to make war preparations? They were going to go and engage in armed conflict with their fellow Israelites. The entire nation brought to the brink of war. Someone had enough sense to appoint a delegation headed by Phinehas. And they went over there, crossed the Jordan, hit him with that. What is this over here? What are you doing? Well, the explanation was this is not a religious site at all. It's what we would call a monument, like the Washington Monument. It's a commemoration site to help their children to maintain their religious and mental and spiritual connection with the other nations, the Western tribes. That's all it was. Nothing wrong with that. That's not against God's will. But notice the vigilance, the concern, the watchfulness, the alertness in this man's life. God commended him, and he will commend us if we will demonstrate that same vigilance. The New Testament has a lot to say about us being vigilant regarding the coming of Jesus. It is coming. And it will come in such a way that you and I will not be able to anticipate it. The Bible makes that clear, regardless of what all of the false prophets and speakers say to the contrary in our country. The New Testament repeatedly says it will be like a thief in the night. I've yet to find anybody who was sitting up knowing that the thief was coming in the night. In fact, Jesus said that in Matthew 24. If you had known, you would have waited up and you wouldn't have let him get what he got. That's how Jesus is going to come. And therefore we must be vigilant, awake, sober, watchful, alert. Paul repeats that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 5, the thief in the night. Jesus repeats it in Revelation 3 to the church at Sardis. We must maintain then a spiritual vigil. Let me close with these two passages, 1 Corinthians 16:13. They need to be sounded over and over in our day. Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men. And Jesus said in Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 35, watch therefore, for you know not when the Lord of the house comes, whether at evening, or at midnight, or at cock crowing, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch.